Good evening, Higgins Theater, and welcome. This is Science on Tap. I'm Dr. Jess Hebert. I will be your MC for the evening. I'm an assistant professor in nephrology at OHSU, and I am a researcher at the intersection of renal and pregnancy health. I'm also, oh, thanks, yes! More power to the pregnancy. I'm also 1/3 of Nerd Pop supergroup, the PDX Broadside. So I like to sing about science and nerdery. One woo. Good. Excellent. That is as expected. I'm so glad that you have all decided to join us here tonight. It's going to be a fantastic talk. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce your speaker, who is a professor in anthropology at Princeton, and recently in May published a book that he's going to be talking about tonight called Science is a Spectrum, and then the rest of the book title just disappeared from my screen. But science is a spectrum, and this is the important part that you need to know. He is also got some history up here in the Pacific Northwest. He was at Central Washington University. Any CWUers here? Excellent. Okay. For a considerable amount of time, he was at Berkeley. He's been a little bit of everywhere, but has settled at Princeton. He's an anthropologist whose main interests are on the biosocial, delving into the entanglement of biological systems with the social and cultural lives of humans, and a few other animals with whom humanity shares very close relations. I want to celebrate the fact that he was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is a frequent publisher in Nature and Science for his amazing work on sex and all the diversity of life. Friends from all over science's beautiful biological spectrum, I would like you to please welcome our friend, Professor Agustín Fuentes.
Okay, that quiz was awesome. You guys already know everything, so we're done. I'd like to take a little time. I want to talk, unfortunately, at you for a little while, because this idea that sex is a spectrum and there's a biological limit on this concept of the binary is really important today, right now, in every one of our lives. So forgive the word I'm about to say here, but this is some serious shit. And there's going to be serious and heavy parts of this, but I'm also going to try to be funny and light about it because this is really important and the conversation must be had. So let's have it. All right, let's start with this. Couple things that we need to know right away, right? What is a binary? A lot of people throw this term around all the time and they have no idea what it means. A binary is exemplified by our famous binary here, right? 1, 0. Anyone here program? Anyone here know how to write code or anything? All right, so the binary system is critically important. So when we talk about a binary, this is the great example. We have a category, numbers, and we have two numbers here, a 1 and a 0. What's really amazing about it is that they're the same category, but they are distinct. There is no overlap between a 1 and a 0, and that's the function, right? There's a 1 and a 0. They are different, distinct entities within the category number. All right, you all with me here? All right. So what is a spectrum? Now, most people think of a spectrum as a line that has like a color grade on it. That's not what a spectrum is. Okay, this is a visual representation of a sound spectrum. What a spectrum is a cluster, a constellation, a movement, a diverse clustering of the same materials that has typical patterns that occur in clusters. You can see these two clusters of sound here. They're very typical. They always show up in this way, but these two clusters are quite different. But they also acknowledge, a spectrum acknowledges that all of the distribution of these patterns don't always occur in the typical clusters. All right? So it's a distribution of the same material that has typical clusters with some of the distribution of that material that does not fit or occur in those typical clusters. Are we on board for both of these things now? All right. So now we got that basics out of the way. Let's ask ourselves, why should we care about sex? I teach a lot about sex biology, sex behavior, sexuality. Why should we care about sex? Because we are human. Every single one of us has biology that's associated with sex. We have sexuality, we have lives, we have identities. Everything we do as a human has some connection to sex, so we should care about it, right? Just from a very basic biological social reality. We should also care about sex because it is messed up right now. The discussion on sex, sexuality, identity, bodies is not just complicated, it's difficult, it's hateful, and it's harmful. And the misuse of biology, the political aggression and harm being done to people right now in the name of arguing or talking about sex and misrepresenting that is critical. So let's spend a little time unpacking some of this stuff in a way that's important. I wrote this book because I do a lot of this work, and over the last 5 to 7 years, it became incredibly apparent that a lot of these people I was having conversations with, even my fellow biologists, didn't have any idea what the F they were talking about. And I got very frustrated in having what I hoped were good faith conversations without a ground. Everyone wanted to talk about here. Like, we have a conversation, someone's like, well, let's talk about this. I'm like, well, you can't start here. You have to have a shared basis. So I wrote this book to facilitate that shared basis. I don't expect anyone to agree with me. I don't care if you agree with me. What I care is to have a basic understanding of what's the distribution of this pattern of sex biology that we're talking about. How does it relate historically and socially? And how can we have a better conversation? Okay? All right, better conversation. Let's do it. All right, so first off, what is sex? And this is something that's very interesting. Most people say, I know what sex is. Do you? Really? Okay. Sex is a biological and evolutionary process. It is a reproductive process. It is a social process. Oh, yeah, is it a social process? It is sex biology, which is all the stuff, and there's a lot of stuff, we're going to talk about it, associated with sex in bodies. There's a whole bunch of stuff. And here, it's also the way in which all that stuff associated with sex in our bodies is used to categorize people. All of these things are sex. And so we need to have a basic understanding of what's going on to be able to talk about sex. And sex and gender are totally connected. So I'm actually going to ignore gender for a little while. I won't really, it'll come up, but we'll come back to it at the end. Gender are the sort of social and historical societal roles that are associated with bodies and patterns. It's really important. You can't really extract it from sex, but let's put it off to the side because we need to know biology to really have this discussion. So let's do it. There's a major assumption across biology. So how many people here have taken a biology class in their life? Thank you. Oh, God. I'm always worried about asking that question. How many of you will recognize this next thing? I can't answer it because you haven't seen it yet, but just think about this. So there's a major assumption in biology and across science and across the entire public. What is that assumption? This is the assumption we're going to gauge with. That assumption is that evolution made females and males really, really different. That's right, right? So these are, I'm going to go out on a limb with this next joke here. So these are African, this is a kind of antelope called the dik-dik, right? So you see the dik-dik female, dik-dik, big giant dik-dik female here, which you already know. Many mammalian females are larger than males. Little teeny cute dik-dik male there. So I am starting, you can tell your friends, you went to a lecture and they started it with a dik-dik pic. Good, I was really worried about that joke. I didn't know if it was going to go over well. Okay, so evolution made males and females really different, right? Why would we think this? Well, because all of the major figures in evolutionary theory and biology have said this to us. So, for example, Darwin says, man is more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than women, and has more inventive genius. Angus Bateman, the guy who founded this sort of notion of why males and females are different, said, well, there is an indiscriminatory eagerness in the males and a discriminatory passivity in the females. E.O. Wilson, sort of one of the fathers of contemporary biology, says the average temperamental difference between the human sexes are also consistent with the generalities of mammalian biology. Women, as a group, are less assertive and less physically aggressive. The physical and temperamental differences between men and women have been amplified by culture into universal male dominance. Okay, these guys have a few issues. here's what they're talking about. Here's this sort of common theme in biology. This is an image, right? A reconstructed image of a large gamete, an ova, and a bunch of small gametes, the sperm, in a uterine environment. Okay, one of the fallopian tubes, actually. So what this argument that Darwin, that Bateman, that Wilson, and that many, many biologists and much of the public are making is that anisogamy, the fact that in most sexually reproducing species, one group of bodies make a big gamete, an ova, called an egg, and other groups of bodies make these small gametes, the sperm. And that difference is massive because it means that there's a huge variation in what males can do. Males make a bunch of sperm, that's their whole investment. Whereas the females make this big egg and then have to, take care of it, and they invest a lot. So, as Angus Bateman said, there's an indiscriminatory eagerness in the males and a discriminatory passivity in females. In other words, the sort of central thesis in a lot of biology is that males are like, let's go have sex, ooh! And females are like, ooh, I better pick the right male. I really have to be careful about this. It's actually not funny. This is very serious because this is the broad assumption. Problem is, if you look at the data, they don't actually support that for many species. Yes, in some species that happens. Interestingly, in fruit flies, where Angus Bateman made this argument, it doesn't work. He got his data wrong. Maybe he faked it, maybe he didn't, but he was wrong. So what we see is that across the landscape of animals, there's a lot of variation in what big or small gametes means, and it isn't consistent across the animal kingdom. So this assumption that males and females have evolved very different things because of these gametes doesn't quite hold up. Let me give you an example. 5 mammals. Why does everyone laugh if I put a picture of Taylor Swift up on the screen? I think, anyway. Okay, so 5 mammals, right? All of these are female mammals. They all produce large gametes, right? So the basic assumption about the world of difference between males and females should hold true here. All of these females share everything in common, right? They produce a large gamete. So here we have a female spotted hyena. Here we have a female queen naked mole rat. Here we have a female cotton-top tamarin. Here we have a female red kangaroo and her very cute Joey. And here we have Taylor Swift, that classically is total representative of the average woman in our species. So all of these produce large gametes. Are there bodies, lives, evolutionary histories, ecologies, sensations, perceptions, physical morphology the same? That's actually an easy question. What's the answer? No. No, they are not. Yes, they all produce large gametes, and they potentially gestate and possibly lactate. But actually, the entire variety of their behavior, physiology, and much of their evolutionary history is quite different. Gametes don't tell us that much. So sex, biology, humans, it's really all pretty confusing. If this basic assumption of biology is not like everything about how we understand males and females, what's going on? Well, whenever I get confused about things, I say, you know what we need to do? We need to science I don't usually use heck, I use another word, but that's okay. We need to science the heck out of this. I'm going to go back. You referenced dorks, right? So I'm a science dork. I actually love the scientific method, like testing stuff, like data and analyses. It's really important. So when we have these conflicts, when things are messy and complicated, let's get a lot of people together. Let's practice the scientific method. Let's gather data. Let's create some hypotheses, run tests, analyze them, and try to interpret those data. Let's do that. Let's do that. But first, before we do that, the most important part of the evening. Thank you. A toast to science. Oh, that's the brown ale. That is really good. In the beginning, there was no sex. This is actually a very important science thing. You guys all know this, right? For the first billion years of life or so, there was no sex. Then sex evolved. Boom! Before sex happened, we did it this way. I'm saying life on this planet. Before sex evolved, reproduction, remember, reproduction and sex are not the same thing. Reproduction was asexual. So when organisms needed to sort of reproduce, they copied their genetic material and they're like, split into two. It's actually the best way to reproduce. No muss, no fuss, boom. However, by about, a billion years into the life on this planet, we're living in these sort of primordial ooze, and, some nutrients, a bunch of different chemicals in there. But there were some temperature fluctuations. And lots of times when the temperature fluctuated, these things that had been reproducing asexually, the only variation in those offspring is sort of random mutation. So when things really changed, there's not much adaptability. There's not much flexibility in these organisms to sort of meet the new changes. So slowly over time, we saw probably many times the evolution of something different. In these primordial pools, these same species, same clusters of organisms started to differentiate a little bit. And these different organisms, rather than splitting, right, copying themselves, what they did is they bundled their genetic material into little packets, and they sort of shared these packets with each other, like, hey, have some of my DNA. And they produced slightly different novel organisms. Sex did not evolve for reproduction. Reproduction was already there. Sex evolved to produce variation. Variation is the heart of sex. Don't forget that. All right, so sex evolved to produce variation. Now, let us be clear. There is a binary in the world that's really important, anisogamy, right? When you have sexually reproducing organisms, pretty much all of them have a big gamete and a small gamete. That is true, but anisogamy doesn't tell us that much. Keep that in mind. Because even though gametes are binary, I'm going to show you that almost nothing else in our bodies is binary. So, for example, let us take your and my, and these are human reproductive anatomy, right? Here's the sort of what we call the female and the male reproductive tracts. They actually all come from the same stuff. For example, gonads. We talked about gonads earlier. Gonads are very important. It's nice to have gonads. Gonads come from the Wolffian and Mullerian ducts in the gonadal ridge here. At about weeks 4 to 7 or 8, we get this sort of beginning of differentiation, right? And then by about week 18, 19, 20, you start to get sort of these real differentiations depending on genetics, depending on developmental processes, and a bunch of other things. And so you get from the same material sort of two typical endpoints with a lot of overlap. So for example, there's mosaicism, where, and there's, 250, 300 people in here? A cluster of us, without knowing it, have mosaic gonads. We have either ovaries or testes with the other material in them. That's part of the developmental process. So there's two typical outcomes, but they're not actually binary. Is everyone following me on this? All right. So another thing that's really interesting about the systems that are necessary to produce gametes and gametes, genitals. So genitals, we talked about the evolution of the two-sex system, right? Or when people started using that. In the 17 and 1800s, they're like, two sexes. It's not one sex, it's two sexes. We'll use genitals to tell the difference. But if you actually look at genitals across the board, they're not binary. There's a huge overlap because all of our genitals, as humans, come from the same place, right? They're all, by about 7 to 9 weeks, from these early genital tubercle and neurogenital sinuses, and then depending on hormonal and other tissue developmental processes, they tend to develop into two broader typical patterns. Is everyone following that? But the overlap is enormous. So genitals and gonads are not binary. Okay, well then, of course, like your 23rd chromosome, your sex chromosomes are binary, right? You have XX or XY. Nope, not binary. It turns out that XX and XY are typical, but you can have other variations, XXY, XYY, and other things like that. But even if you are typical XY, there's still actually a number of things that can turn on and turn off or work or not work and give you a huge variation, in fact, a spectrum of outcomes. So genitals, gonads, and 23rd chromosomes, these classic things that everyone has used to say this is the differentiating between males and females, have typical distributions but exist on a spectrum, not a binary. All right, we all on board here so far? All right, okay. So let's actually spend a little time outside of us, come back to us, but let's talk about other animals. Because, well, let me ask you a question. Why should we care about other animals? Why would we even do any comparative approaches? We are animals. And people don't like to say that, but look, you're a mammal, you're a primate. And so to understand what is distinctive about humans and what we share in common with the world, we need to do some comparisons. So when we are interested in sex biology, we need to compare across the animal kingdom. So let's take a look at a few animals. There's the basic thing here. This is the way most people think about animal sex biology. Here's a peacock and a peahen. Big peacock, small peahen, they're really different. They're sexually dimorphic, right? How many got that one right? Excellent. So they're sexually dimorphic. This is the way we think of animal sex. But there's actually a whole bunch of other ways to do it. Bees, for example, bees have 2 genetic patterns and 3 different types of bodies, right? There's 2 types of large gamete producers, the queen, who actually produces large gametes, then all the other females that don't actually produce large gametes, usually, sometimes they do, and then males. And they have different genetic patterns and 2 different genetic patterns and 3 different bodies. There are all of the worms, earthworms, for example, are all hermaphrodites, right? All earthworms in the one body produce both large gamete and small gamete producing physiology, and they get together to exchange stuff. Other worms like C. elegans, has anyone ever heard of C. elegans? It is the most commonly used sort of biological experimenting worm. C. elegans has 2 sexes. One is hermaphrodite and one is male. There are no female C. elegans. Blue-headed wrasse, one of my favorite fish. So the blue-headed wrasse is born, right, grows up, and when it matures into a physiology that produces large gametes, right, what we would call a female. And so there's 50 or 60 blue-headed wrasse on a little coral reef here, right? And as those wrasse grow, the biggest one out of that 50 or 60 changes their physiology from a large gamete producer to a small gamete producer, right? But if another larger blue-headed wrasse migrates into that population, they're like, ooh, oh no, and they change back to a female. So blue-headed, and there's some blue-headed wrasse that are born, mature, and they stay small-bodied, but they produce small gametes or sperm. So for blue-headed wrasse, you can have 1 genome, 1 body, and up to 3 or 4 different sexual biologies across your lifetime. That's pretty cool. Naked mole rats again. So if there is a God, they either have a great sense of humor or are very cruel. I don't know. Anyways, naked mole rats are fascinating because they are mammals with a bunch of typical mammalian things, but their social system is like that of insects. There is one large female who does all the reproduction, some males that provide the small gametes, and a bunch of other females that don't reproduce. But there's no hormonal differences. There's no specific physiological differences. Something is going on that makes these mammals look like insects, but they don't have the same systems as insects. Also fascinating. Turtles. Turtles are awesome because turtle sex is not determined by genes or hormones. What is turtle sex determined by? Does anyone know? The temperature of the sand in which the eggs are laid. Super cool. Whiptail lizard, we heard about earlier. Whiptail lizards have just said, you know what? We don't need males. Whiptail lizards, 5 species, have only large gamete producers. They've developed a system where they can actually create internal variation within the genomes of those gametes that they produce, and small gamete producers, males, have disappeared. Crocuta, the female spotted hyena here, and you saw this in the question. So female spotted hyenas are larger than males. As they develop, their clitoris and labial tissue form a large phallic tube, and other parts of the labial tissue form a scrotum. They use these phallus in social displays. Females are dominant to males, and they show their dominance by getting these phallus, their sort of clitoris erect and putting in the face of the male. However, many early researchers were like, well, of course, these are masculinized animals. These female hyenas they must be testosterone. Nope. They have pretty typical mammalian hormone patterns. This is just another way to be female. It's not masculinized, it's hyena. And finally, one of my favorite, this is Aotus, the owl monkey. It's a nocturnal monkey, very rare, lives in Argentina, southern Brazil, a few other places. And what's really interesting is that the male and female are about the same size. The female gives birth to the young, and immediately on giving birth is like, here. Gives it to the male takes it, male does 100% of the carrying and care for the young, giving it back to the female to nurse, she nurses and gives it back to the male. Why do I highlight this? Very interesting. There's not some radical change in bodies. It's just a different way of caretaking and social system. There are many ways to do sex biology in the animal kingdom. There's not one way to be female. There's not one way to be male. So anyone who tells you that biology says this is just lying to you. All right. Humans. All right, now we're going to do some humans, a little bit more, and then we'll have some Q&A. Let's spend a little time with humans because we are super messy. When you study humans, it's really nice studying some other animals because they're not that messy. Humans are super messy, and we are biocultural. Everything we do is an infusion of biology and culture. Let me just give you one example. Everyone think about your foot for a moment. I'm going somewhere with this, so stay with me. Your foot. Does everyone ever wonder about that, like, pinky toe? What's up with the pinky toe? I sound like a Seinfeld, but no, really, what is, like, the pinky toe is like all curved under the other toes, right? Did anyone ever think about this? Anyone think about, like, why is my pinky toe weird? Your pinky toe is weird because you wear shoes your whole life. You have modified the ligamentary, skeletal, and muscular structures of your foot by culture. Everything about your body is biocultural. It's your genes, it's your bones, it's your muscles, and your cultural history and patterns, okay? So that means when we talk about humans, we can't get out of this. I'm going to show you a bunch of stuff, and I'm going to try to do it in a non-cultural way, but I'm going to fail because you're going to impose culture on everything I tell you. So just keep that in mind. All right, so let's just spend a few minutes talking about the reality of human biological variation in the context of these things we call sex categories, these typical distributions, male and female. Okay? You guys ready for this? All right. Number one, height. Everyone knows guys are bigger than gals, right? So here's a nice US overview, and this is good for any population around the world. Yes, on average, the median male height is larger than the median female height, with about a 78% overlap. That means if you were to use just height to identify sex, you would be wrong 7 out of 10 times. That's actually really important. It also is true for weight. NHANES data set is one of the largest data sets for US populations, and the vast majority of weight, that is between 136 and 263 pounds, which is almost 80% of the weight distribution of people in the United States, is filled by both males and females. So at the extremes of both height and weight, we get more males at the upper end and more females at the lower end, but the overlap is enormous. So weight and height are not specifically tied across most of the population to sex. Muscles. Everyone knows there's big differences in muscles, right? Men have, on average, greater upper body density and muscle layering, so relative muscle weight, and it's a little bit less in the lower body. But what people don't really think about is this is on average, and it is also tied to the biocultural pattern of training. There is a significant difference, but it overlaps a lot. We all have exactly the same muscles, the same ligaments. But the variation in male and female bodies in the upper body can be fairly pronounced, especially after puberty and depending on how one lives their lives. We'll come back to this. But this is a difference, but it's not a binary difference. It's a patterned typical difference. All right, organs. So here's where I would have loved to have passed around a bunch of hearts and livers, but they would put me in jail if I did that. But I think it's really cool because how do you tell whether a heart is male or female? You don't. Organs don't come in his and hers versions. That's not the way it works, right? None of these things are his and hers. What is fascinating, though, is the body an organ lives in modifies it and changes it. So gender, diet, age, alcohol consumption, pharmaceutical consumption, a variety of other activity patterns all impact organs and shape them. But sex is not one of those things. Actually, sex hormones don't even have that major effect on organ development relative to many other patterns. That's actually really important. Everyone knows, right? If you're getting an organ transplant, is sex a consideration? Nope. All right, hair. Everyone knows, I hope you know, we have two types of hair. We have vellus hairs and terminal hairs. Vellus hairs is that peach fuzz stuff, right? Just little hair everywhere, which you can't really see. Terminal hairs are the big hairs that we can see. Humans are weird because we have terminal hairs in the inguinal, axial, right, and the head area. But humans have a huge variation in terminal hair across their body, across populations. Some populations have lots, other populations have little on their body. We all have lots on our head. But, interestingly, biologically and scientifically, we say there's hirsutism. Does anyone know the definition of hirsutism? Male-like hair pattern in a female. So, according to that, male-like hair pattern in a female, 10 to 15% of all those identified as women are hirsute, and in many societies, up to 35% of women are hirsute. It's a cultural definition. There is no male-like pattern. There's huge variation in hair patterns across humans. What about fat deposition? This is one of the most common ways in which we talk about fat deposition in humans. I've actually used this image in one of my textbooks, but this is the actual image. We actually deposit fat all in the same ways, but in slightly different densities. So it turns out that humans deposit fat in very interesting ways, and 30 to 60% of individuals with testes will develop mammary tissue. So man boobs are not man boobs. They're human mammary tissue. The distribution of fat patterns is actually not binary. It's accentuated by different types of behavior and patterns. It's impacted by pregnancy. So if you're pregnant or not, that has an impact. A wide variety of things impact it, but it's not binary. Okay, hormones, the most binary thing on the planet, right? So the endocrine system is what produces hormones. What do you notice about the endocrine system in this typical male and typical female? Except for the gonads, they are the same. And that's true for all of our hormones. Most people fail on this question in the United States when asked. They're like, are there male and female hormones? The answer is absolutely not. There are human hormones. Actually, there are mammalian hormones. We share them all, and actually we share this with a lot of other animals. Progesterone, testosterone, estrogen, and many other hormones vary in their fluctuating, circulating levels by sex and by age and by body size and by BMI and by nutritional status and by health status. They vary by a lot of different things. Yes, there are some important differences in the patterns, but they're not in any way, shape, or form binary. Brains. Here is the famous image, about 7 years old now, of the most sort of important brain difference paper, where they argued that we have finally shown absolutely unequivocally there are male and female differences in significant differences in brains. So statistically, those are differences. But even in this, when they found some volumetric differences across male-female brains in morphology, what percentage of the variance in brains did sex explain? 1%. 99% of all morphological variation in our brains is explained by things that are not related to sex biology. Okay, but then there are some really big differences that are important, right? To be pregnant, right, to become pregnant, you must have a uterus, a particular set of hormone patterns, fallopian tubes, And to lactate, you have to have glandular development. And to get all those things, you have to have particularly, you need ovaries, you need a variety of other things. So this, you could say, well, this is the big giant difference, right? Well, all the people who have all those things don't necessarily become pregnant. And what's most amazing is that humans are actually really interesting in their physiological adaptations to caretaking, because it is not just those individuals who get pregnant that have all the physiological responses. So for example, another thing I'd like to do but would be thrown in jail is if I brought in like 20 newborn infants and said, everyone take off your shirt and rub the infants on you. Don't do that, that's weird. But if you did that, you would all have these spikes in prolactin and progesterone and oxytocin, and you would all respond the same way. Humans, regardless of which genitals or gonads you have, respond the same way physiologically to infant contact. We evolved, and there's very good evidence on this, I talk a lot about it in the book, a very complex, collaborative biocultural caretaking system, and that has reshaped our bodies and brains. So even in this, what we think of as the most different pattern, reproduction, there's an incredibly distinctive human pattern of coming together and not being all that different. Okay, so sex biology is about patterns and variation. It's not about a binary. Now, don't get me wrong, males and females are not the same, and this is really important, and we haven't talked a lot about this, but not everyone fits biologically into the typical patterns of male and female. Remember what I said about a spectrum. So we have to keep that in mind. Most human biological variation is not distributed in a binary or even dimorphic fashion. Now you guys all know what dimorphic means, so that's really important. And this is my favorite part, dude, we're a lot more complex and wonderful than that. So here's where I'd like to start, but I'm gonna end, or come close to ending. Look, we are super complicated. Anyone who tells you that sex is, as the recent executive order says, established at conception. First of all, nothing is established at conception. And conception is the wrong term. It's actually fusion. It's gametic fusion. And you got some cool stuff going on, but you have no sex, believe me. Humans are biocultural and we're gender sexed. Everything we do is bodies and histories and cultures and experiences and relations. And if we don't start there in this discussion, we are screwing ourselves. We're doing harm. And so to not start there is intentionally to deny the humanity of who we are. So let me give you just really, really briefly, and then we'll open it up for questions. Let me give you a couple examples why the devotion to the binary is really a problem. If we're devoted to the binary, we believe that males are this way, females are that way. Males are, let's say, human males are hunters, fathers, doing this stuff. Females are caretakers, mothers. How many of you guys have a family? Dude, every one of you has a family. Well, that's the way things work. We all come from, we didn't just like appear in the world. Human families throughout time and today are incredibly complex, are not necessarily linked to which kind of genitals or gonads or genes you have, but are in fact complex caretaking assemblages that are diverse in their construction and important and central in their impact. If you are committed to the binary, as many governors and much of our federal administration now is, you develop laws which deny families the right to create, to collaborate, to come together. And who gets harmed? Children. The children are harmed by the laws that mandate a binary nuclear family orientation. There's way more ways, not that there's anything wrong with a nuclear family, but there's many more ways to be human. And in fact, those other ways are typical. And to make them illegal or to ban them from possibilities is to harm. Okay, sexual orientation. A lot of people like to think, well, there's gay and straight. All the people who argue for gay and straight clearly have their own issues. There is no such thing as only two options for being human. Everyone knows that. So what's really interesting is the data are clear and evident. Humans and many other primates and many social mammals are incredibly complex sociosexually. To try to make sex, behavior, sexuality, and sexual identity a binary is to reject science and reject the data. Don't do it. Sports. We can talk about elite athletes, but I don't want to. Why? How many of you are elite athletes? None of us. We spend all our time talking about elite athletes, which is important. There's some stuff to talk about. But dude, those, when you talk about a distribution pattern, those are the extremes. I'm actually, as a scientist, interested in the rest of us. So when we talk about sports and things like that, why don't we talk about, if we're really interested in supporting women's sports, why don't we talk about funding women's sports? Why don't we talk about paying the amazing WNBA athletes the same as we pay the NBA athletes? Why don't we recognize the science that shows that before puberty, gendered leagues actually do not matter for the vast majority of sports, and funding for sports in non-gender bias or gender distinct ways facilitates mental and physical health. If we really care, we'd follow the science. And finally, let's just do really quickly medical stuff. Clearly, female and male are important medical categories that we should look at, but not always. For example, in the quiz, we see that women are much more likely to, in the United States, to report higher negative side effects from drugs. Part of that is because the social cultural pattern of not testing drugs on the whole population. But another part of that, which is not included in many of these studies, is that women take pharmaceutical drugs at a much higher rate than men, and most of those studies were not corrected for that statistical difference. Also, they assumed that the difference impacting women was BMI or body size, and it turns out that also is not true. The assumption of a binary difference between men and women has hindered the actual understanding of why we have these different pharmacological impacts. I'll give you another example. If you are a woman, you are much more likely to die in the year after a heart attack than if you are a man. We know there's no biological difference between male and female hearts. There are other things going on, but the research has not looked at this broader complex of heart disease and heart patterns, except in the fact that we are really interested in men's hearts and we know how to predict men's problems. But why do women die more likely afterwards? That is a set of studies that were funded recently and cut recently. Finally, let me give you another example. We know, it's actually very clear, that neurobiological disorders, a variety of different kinds of spectral disorders, show up differently in boys and girls, in young humans. But we know the brains aren't morphologically different. What's going on? No one wants to study that because everyone studies what's wrong with male brains, what's wrong with female brains. Those questions are not going to get us the answers. So many times we should ask sex-based or category questions, but not always. The binary approach as an exclusive approach in medicine is harming all of us. Look, we're people. We're humans. We're complicated, we're messy, we're sexual. Let's just lean into that. Let's not pretend like this isn't a damn mess, that it isn't damn complicated, and let's do the science to understand what's going on without predetermining a binary or a politically conservative approach to dividing humans into two classes when we know there's a lot more going on. It's not a binary, it's a spectrum, and we need a better conversation. Thank you very much.
Dr. Agustín Fuentes, everybody. So we're going to take some questions and answers. I had a bit of a fall this morning, so usually I would run around, but we're not going to do that. Instead, my friend Cass here is going to run around taking your questions. Couple of housekeeping things. One, Cass is going to hold the mic, not you, please. Number two, your question must end in a question mark. We're not here for comments. We're not here for your gotcha moments. Those get 86. All right? Okay. And last maybe one question at a time, please. If you have multiple questions, bank them because Dr. Fuentes will be at his table afterwards. We ask you to line up this way along the wall so you don't block the exit for everyone, but he will be signing his book afterwards for all of you who have your books. And don't forget to pick up your pint glasses if you had 7 or more correct answers or your VIP. Anything else? Great. Let's get to the questions. Cass, everybody give it up for Cass, one of the volunteers here at Science on Tap.
It's like a regular class. Questions? I was like, yep, it's fun.
At the beginning, you kind of put the term gender on hold with a couple of question marks and said we'll get back to it, and I don't know that we actually ever did. But I'm curious, can you give a definition of what transgender means? That's really confusing.
So thank you. No, so actually, I did gender throughout. I sort of lied to you. I was talking about biocultural and all the patterns. If you notice, I kept throwing in all of these things about culture, about diet, about all those things. That's gender. We are gendered organisms, right? Our cultural dynamics, our expectations of how bodies should be, influence the way bodies are, and that's gender. So transgender, in the general context, is an individual who is in a body who senses a complete disassociation or serious discomfort or disability to be in that body. And that is well documented and actually very important. So there are a number of different kinds of senses of embodiment, and that's one of them. And it is a not uncommon pattern in humans. And there's a huge range of sensations of being in one's body. And I think it's really important because people tend to think of like, oh, that's all in your head. No, it's actually in your body. We are always in our body. There's no such thing as in your head, because in your head is your body too. You guys are easy to clap. That's awesome.
Given that you emphasized, really, really well the cultural aspect of this, right, being at the core of it. So if it's not a science issue and it is entirely a cultural issue, right? The question is, are there best practices, strategies that have worked anywhere in the world? Because culture, again, is highly
Worked for what? Best practice strategies for?
to combat the cultural locus, right? If it's a cultural artifact, and any thoughts, ideas on what can shift the conversation because of that reason. Science would be an easier problem to solve.
Actually, so you're right and wrong at the same time. No offense, but so I'm an anthropologist, so culture can be approached scientifically, and I think that's really important. The idea, what you said, I think, is in one sense, a scientific and experimental argument. Like, what is it about cultural diversity or different cultures around the world? How do they engage with this notion of diversity or different bodies or things like that? And so what anthropologists have been doing for a long time is running around the world and be like, oh, check this out, check this out, check this out. There's lots of different ways to do things. A good example I'll give you is there's this assumption, particularly here in the West, in the United States, sort of Western Europe, that the nuclear family, right, a heterosexual cis pair with their offspring is the sort of standard unit of a familial structure. Actually, that's never been true. It's not true right now. It's very atypical for most of humanity, and even in the societies where that is assumed to be, extended families are actually more common residential structures. So the answer, both scientific and sort of ethnographic or cultural, is to study across what we call ethnology, to look around how do different cultures engage with this. So one of the important things is that we know across many cultures over the last couple thousand years, where we have some evidence, sexual identities, sort of gender roles, have varied a lot, right? There are some typical patterns, but there's a lot of variation. And so when people say, no, this is what gender is, or this is the way roles are, we can show that that is not true for all societies. And in fact, it's frequently not even true for the society that these people are asserting it in. And so data are very important. And here I'll just go back to this data geek thing. People make assertions all the time about what is without actually understanding or engaging the diversity of patterns that are evident in human societies.
You showed the the bell curves of like male and female neural activity, and I'm curious if like intra-gender, like what the variety might have looked like between just males and just females.
So I would have loved to have given you a whole talk on, you guys have to go see a brain, sort of neurobiology. So I work with a bunch of great neurobiologists. Lise Elliott is a great person to look at. Daphne Joel, there's a variety of good folks who do this. So it's amazing. That was actually morphology, not neural activity that I showed. So, but what's really interesting is even in morphology, there's way more variation intra-sex category, way more. That's why sex is a bad. So whenever you say male brain, female brain, you're just not talking science. Now, what's really interesting though, is if you look at MRI, so activation. So when you guys don't know this, we study brains by we show you something or tell you something and see what your brain does, sort of where it turns on and turns off. We can measure heat or electric activity. What's fascinating is we can take clusters of like 7 to 8 year olds, both, who are gender male, gender woman, gender man, boys and girls, 15, 16 year olds, 23, 24 year olds, and 30 year olds. And the differences are almost negligible. We don't find anything in the kids. We start to see some activation differences in the teenagers. And by 23, 24, man, it's like, wow, these people who identify as male or female or masculine or feminine, which is really interesting, regardless of genitals, show up really differently. That's gender. And it's amazing because it shows up in the brain, life experience and these kinds of concepts. But it's not binary, but it is really, it just shows you how melded we are, right? There's other great stuff about smells, right? Gendered smelling things. Yeah, so let me give you a thing. So for those of you who identify as women or feminine, it turns out you respond to smells a lot more than those of you who are identify as men and masculine. And in fact, there's all these great T-shirt. You guys remember the T-shirt experiments where they're like gave smelly T-shirts of different men to women, and these people were wearing these T-shirts and like, oh, women smell men and they get turned on or whatever. What they don't tell you is all the women rated the clean T-shirts higher than all of the other T-shirts. So they left that data point out, and I was like, yeah, that was a pretty important one. Data matter.
Okay, it just seems to me that right from the very beginning that the idea of testing would really solve a lot of the problems in our society, and I wonder...
Testing what?
Well, you said there's so much variation. So if people knew what their own genome was, and or if there was a way to, to know, like, oh yeah, in me, I'm over here on the spectrum, and you are over there on the spectrum. So, is there anything like that going on?
Well, there's two answers to that. The first answer is we don't actually know what all those things mean, right? So we assume that like, oh, hey, let's look at your SRY or 5 or 6 other genetic sequences that we think are associated with testicular or ovarian development, right? Turns out they vary a lot. We can tell you some patterns, but it's not 100%. Or we also find out, and this has happened to 23andMe, this is one of their issues. One of the problems was people would get their results back and find out that they weren't exactly what they thought. But they were what they thought. They were who they are. And the problem is there isn't a direct correlation between, let's say, genetic sequences and most of who you are. There are some important patterns and some processes. So what we don't do also is test gonads. So for example, a lot of us, not a lot of us, but a percentage, there's enough people here that some of us have what are called chimeric gonads, right? So I have testes, for example. I may very well have some ovarian tissue in my testes. I will never know that. I'm not going to get them sampled and biopsied to check it out, but it doesn't make any difference to me. And so one of the problems is that we assume there's a biological indicator of who we are in these kinds of contexts. What would be really important is to be testing across these things to understand what's even the baseline variation. That's what we don't know. So, for example, they'll never let me do this, but I want all 23andMe's. How many of you gave your spit in a tube and paid 23andMe to take over your DNA? Yeah. You know they sold it, right? They're going to do a whole bit. Anyways, you can get it back. You can still reclaim it. And you can get all the raw data and give it to a geneticist and use it. But anyway, what would be really interesting is to look at that and ask around SRY. It's a very classic gene on the Y chromosome. We think it's a testes determining factor, that it has a huge, depending on how SRY translates and what the protein it produces, really impacts whether or not you develop testes. We don't actually know what the entire variation in a population is of that SRY gene. We're not even 100% sure how many alleles, how many variations there are on it. So actually studying what the spectrum looks like, what the variation looks like, would tell us a lot, and that's where I totally agree with you. But no one wants to pay for that. Because their assumption is, well, we want to study what's male and what's female, not what's human. And that's the problem. And I'll tell you right now, I have thoughts on all this, but right now, the NIH has taken off. In the last few years, there's been some great proposals that have been funded to look across a wide range of sexualities, a wide range of bodies, and to try to get better understanding what do these genomic landscapes and epigenomic landscapes look like? What do these proteomic landscapes look like? All of them are cut. Knowledge is being killed, and science is being denied. Boo indeed.
We have two more questions. Hi, I'm really going to try to make this into a question, but I'm just trying to broaden my understanding, and I think I get a little bit hung up on terms like identify or expression, or trans, where it sounds like something's becoming, or there's a choice in expression or identification. Is there a better way for me to kind of think about it as a part of just like a state of being? Like,
You answered. No, that's a great question. A state of being is a great way to talk about it, because what the terminology around a lot of identity, a lot of sensation of self in humans is always this weird Freudian notion of intentionality. This idea that identity is something we intend upon or manifest in ourselves. As someone who studies human biology in the context of cultural experience, I'm like, yeah, but there's also genes and bones and muscles and hormones. And so it's always a mixture, a biocultural mixture of these things. The problem with the term identity is that we think of it in this kind of psychological sense, but it's actually an embodied sense. It's a deep context. And here I just think with some of the amazing trans scholars, Paisley Cura, Zachary Du Bois, and others who do this really good work of showing what embodiment means in these different sort of non-typical, right, but completely within the spectrum of human experience, senses of self and experiences of embodiment. And I think that's really important. So rather than thinking of identity, let's think about bodies and sensations. Think about how you feel. And I like to talk about this when I teach sex and sexuality. Look, every one of us at many points in our life is like, huh. What's going on? How does it work? Especially, remember when you were 13? 12 or 13. I remember 12 or 13, I'm like, I don't know. What's happening here? Something's going on. And everyone goes through that, and there are different patterns of going through that. And I think we need to recognize that the biocultural sensation is not in our head or in our body. It's always both, right? Humans embody ourselves. And so what here in this kind of context, and what I think is really important, is when a young person, when a child says, hey, I feel this way, this is something I'm feeling, we need to listen to them. We need to spend time, open our hearts and minds, and recognize that as humans, there's a huge diversity of ways of being, and not immediately impose upon them an expectation to be a certain way, because the binary is harmful in that sense, and the spectrum opens us up to more possibilities.
and sadly, this is our last question.
Speaking to the harm that you're talking about, I'm
had evidence that when I was at birth, I was surgically modified in some way to fit a narrative that was preferred or desired. So the question of what work you're doing in anthropology and academia, do you see other people working, spreading the good news, the good gospel, as it were?
So let me acknowledge the horrific violence done by the medical establishment and our cultures in assuming that at birth you can tell who someone is. You cannot, on many levels. To look as we do, there's this whole idea of sex at birth. You guys have heard this term. Like, that is not a biological term. That's a cultural assumption. And the diversity and patterns of development, especially over the course of life and around puberty, are radically different across individuals. And so I think it's really important to think through that. So there are a number of anthropologists, a number of human biologists actually publishing this and doing this. But I tell you, you guys are awesome to come to this talk. This book, this talk that I gave you tonight, has been canceled in multiple places, including major universities, has been shut down, and places, I've written a lot of books, places that invite me for op-eds and for things like that have rejected them. The New York Times invited me to submit an op-ed about this book, and I wrote the most vanilla, nice piece about supporting sports and women and all this. And you know what they said? No, thank you, Agustín. So it's not good. It's bad, but that's why everyone in my position, I'm a full professor, I'm a tenured professor at Princeton, should be yelling and saying and writing and talking. And everyone in your position, a human being, should be talking to your friends. And like when people say stupid shit, call them out on it. I mean, we know what's going on. And the idea that we're going to allow a government to attack people who are vulnerable at the expense of children and adults, a society doesn't work that way. Community, human evolution is concentrated around collaboration and cooperation, sometimes for horrible stuff, but that's what we do. That baby thing, when I told you about rubbing babies on you, I'm not joking. It's absolutely amazing. Humans, unlike most mammals, how many of you have been around an infant near birth, right? No matter what your genitals or your gonads or your DNA are, when you're around that birth, you felt it. Your progesterone was like, bam! Your prolactin was like going, your oxytocin was going up. It also works with puppies and kittens. So it's amazing. We are wired to do this kind of caretaking, and that's part of this collaboration, and it is critically tied to gender and sexuality. And to pretend it's not is anti-science and antithetical to the human condition. So, I'm a professor, so I'm giving you homework for the rest of your life. You now know all this stuff, right? Don't harass everyone all the time, but harass some people some of the time. Thank you very much.
That's the encore clapping. Encore, encore, one more talk. Thank you, everyone, for attending Science on Tap. We want to thank our Science on Tap volunteers, our sound people, everyone who did the trivia at the front, and, of course, our speaker for this evening, Dr. Agustín Fuentes.